Thank you, Karen. And I thought you said you were going to keep it short. Thank you so much for that warm and generous introduction and welcome. And thank you very much for this invitation to you and Martin and Giorgio and Anne. And also very many thanks to everybody else who has helped put this together, especially Charlotte. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Very good. Yeah. And of course, it's a privilege to meet David and Anne Rumsey in person. It was wonderful to make their acquaintance as well. So I'll sail right in with this image and an introduction which goes with it, but I'll come back to it very much later. On April 3rd, 1984, Rakesh Sharma, a 34-year-old Air Force pilot, became the first astronaut from India to go into orbit above Earth. As is known to Indians who shared that moment, including me, when reportedly asked by the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi what India looked like from outer space, Sharma responded with words made memorable by the poet Muhammad Iqbal, ironically deemed one of the founding fathers of Pakistan. Quote, "Sare jahan se acha Hindustan hamara." Of all places on earth, India is the best. So the full-throated patriotism of Sharma's response should perhaps not surprise us, as the space race conducted by numerous nation-states across the continents over the past century and into the present has shown us repeatedly, the extraterrestrial activities of humanity have only shored up terrestrial passions and chauvinisms, ancient and modern. Sharma's maiden orbit did not yield iconic images like the ones that awed the world when the US space missions from a couple decades earlier beamed back mesmerizing photographs such as Earthrise and Blue Marble. As the brilliant, wide-ranging scholarship on this subject has shown us, images like these fueled all manner of global fantasies of new kinds of mastery, but also provoked anxieties about Earth's vulnerability. Even as such images revealed the futility, indeed total irrelevance, of man-made boundaries and borders created by modern nation-states, policed by troops and guns, not to mention walls. Sharma's response from outer space to his prime minister recalls as well, for me, colorful prints and chromolithographs mass-produced in droves up until today in India. They show various historical personages in the company of the terrestrial globe, with the outline map of India clearly marked, and frequently the only country that matters. Thus, here we see Mahatma Gandhi cheerfully walking across India, holding his spinning wheel and his walking stick. And here we have Jawaharlal Nehru, not yet Prime Minister, but already worrying over the fate of his country as he looks off into a distance, sitting before a giant terrestrial globe on its stand with Asia and India delineated and named. Such prints also show Mother India, the Indian nation and national territory imagined as goddess, as well as all manner of Hindu deities in the company of the terrestrial globe. Consider a late 19th, possibly early 20th century print mass-produced by a publisher who made such god posters famous across the length and breadth of British India. As known to many a Hindu devout, once upon a time in the cosmic past, the mighty Lord Vishnu took the form of the boar known as Varaha in order to rescue Prithvi, the goddess Earth, imagined as female and helpless, from the clutches of the demon Hiranyaksha, who had spirited her away to the depths of the cosmic ocean. The printed poster shows a blue-grey Varaha, half man, half boar, emerging from the primeval waters, his four hands bearing the standard symbols associated with Vishnu. He's gloriously adorned in jewels, a crown atop his head. But arguably the most notable feature of this poster for our purposes is the striking terrestrial globe perched on Varaha's tusks, the land masses and oceans marked with some degree of cartographic fidelity. As importantly, the globe is centered on the Indian subcontinent. The poster seems to suggest that not only is Varaha's rescuing Earth on this primeval mission, but India as well. From the perspective of the long representational history of the cosmic act of Varaha rescuing Earth, a history that stretches back to the early first millennium CE, from when the first lithic monuments depicting the event have survived in India, the poster marks a fundamental departure. Prithvi, goddess Earth, is not shown in a conventional manner as a female divinity, beautiful, demure, and obviously in awe of the immense male animal god who saved her from the wicked demon. Instead, her sensuous, sentient, and obviously female body is unambiguously replaced by the inanimate, spherical form of the mathematized terrestrial globe, the proud invention of the relatively recent science of modern cartography. In another print, published in 1953, just a few years after India became independent, and its very first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, committed himself to putting his country onto the path of secular modernization and industrialization, the goddess Earth herself put in an appearance and in the company of the terrestrial globe. Titled in English as Bhudevi, the print shows Earth as a sensuous, sentient, four-armed goddess and as a terrestrial globe, gridded by a graticule of latitudes and longitudes in which the peninsular outline of India clearly dominates. In all such prints, going back to the earliest years of the 20th century and continuing into the present, the divine bodies of Hinduism's numerous divinities are unambiguously locked to the geo-body of the emergent nation, itself a product of colonial and scientific cartography. Such pictures suggest that scientific cartographic knowledge is hijacked to ensure the survival of the gods rather than their exile with the emergence of technological modernity, even as the gods themselves are used to popularize the image of Earth as an impersonal, spherical globe rather than only a sentient being. Most consequentially, through such visual and cartographic acts, Hindu gods are transformed into Indian gods, the geo-body of India nationalizing their divine bodies. With the help of modern cartographic instruments like the globe and the map, Hinduism's ancient deities, rather than becoming irrelevant or redundant, are rejuvenated as members of the emergent nation's geo-body, lending it their aura, their powers, and most importantly, their divinity. Correspondingly, the territory of India is sacralized, transformed from a mathematized geobody on the impersonal face of the terrestrial globe into a hallowed land, a punya bhumi, specially favored by the gods themselves. Dennis Cosgrove has observed that the terrestrial globe, with its geometric grid of latitudes and longitudes, quote, universalizes space, privileging no specific point, extending a non-hierarchic net across the sphere. Yet in these mass-produced artistic works, India appears as the gods' chosen land, centered as these are on the outline map of the nation, which frequently appears as the only territory on the globe's surface, and associating as they do the divine bodies of these ancient deities with the modern nation's geo-body. The program of the Enlightenment, wrote Horkheimer and Adorno famously, was the disenchantment of the world, the dissolution of myths, and the substitution of knowledge for fancy. Yet the contrary manner in which scientific cartography is deployed in these proliferating God pictures of Hindu India demonstrates how the European Enlightenment project is undone in its colonial and post-colonial address by the revival of old myths and the return of fancy. Rather than heathenism and superstitions being demolished, as many modernists, both European and Indian, fervently hoped, the gods have come back even more realistically, exuberantly, and potently, transformed from sectarian Hindu deities into nationalized Indian divinities through the mediation of the very scientific knowledge that ought to have banished them from the lives and livelihoods of their devotees. I begin my reflections on going artfully global with such images from the popular and populist end of the Indian artistic spectrum as a way of paying homage to a wonderfully generative essay by Jennifer Wenzel, published in 2014, entitled Planet versus Globe, an engagement with which allows one to critique the magisterial but quite utterly Eurocentric studies by Dennis Cosgrove and more recently Peter Sloterdijk. In her essay, instead, Wenzel focuses on scenes of world imagining and world making. This phrase has already come up today. So she focuses on these scenes from the global south as a means of getting at what she refers to as subaltern planetary subjectivity, a subjectivity that is frequently at odds with the Apollonian view from high above the earth and the high-minded cosmopolitanism often associated with that perspective. In making this argument, Wenzel also draws upon an earlier important proposition by Tim Ingold, who's also already appeared in this conference, in his seminal essay, Globes and Spheres, The Topology of Environmentalism. In that essay, if you may recall, he described the terrestrial globe as the quintessential world image of colonialism. The globe, he argued, is a preformed surface waiting to be occupied. And he went on to suggest that an imagining of Earth as a mathematized ball covered in latitudes and longitudes consolidated a view of our planet as a world apart from life. In a book I published about a decade ago and that Karen referred to in her kind introduction, drawing upon similar ideas, I was particularly concerned with demonstrating how some Indian artists responded to such a reduction of their country and the world as they imagined it to an impersonal dot on the Earth's mathematized surface. I created the analytical category of barefoot cartography to capture the demotic and everyday uses by artists of expert cartographic knowledge outside the specialized realms of science and the state. I suggested that artful map makers of the street and the Indian bazaar have a critical and constitutive role to play in producing and disseminating knowledge about the form of the nation as well as the shape of the world among the citizenry. It is through the labors of barefoot cartography and such artful map makers, more so arguably than the highly specialized operations of the state or of science, that most Indians became familiar with the shape of the earth and the shape of the national territory that they inhabited. This was especially true during the colonial period, when in most schoolrooms across the country, but especially in village India, where the majority lived, geography books, atlases, maps, globes, and other such modern artifacts were scarce objects indeed, that hardly anyone would have encountered in their daily lives. In contrast, mass-produced and commercially available prints and posters, cheap, numerous, and ubiquitous, attempted to reach the average Indian and deliver their varied image messages. And yet, The knowledge of the world and of the terrain of the country disseminated through mass-produced art is shot through and inflected by the somatic and the worshipful, the commercial and the libidinous, so that India or the globe rarely appear as empty social space or mathematized abstractions. In the artful mapping of the Indian popular sphere, bodies appear to matter more than boundaries, the affective more than the abstract. Indeed, I would argue that this has been the case since early modern times, when cartographic objects such as the atlas, the map, and the globe began to enter the Indian subcontinent, mostly through the mediation of Jesuit missionaries and Dutch and English traders and ambassadors acting on their behalf. To make this argument, I turn from the colorful mass-produced images of popular Indian art to the other end of the artistic spectrum, to engage with singular and rare miniature paintings found only in the best-known museums of the world or in the hands of wealthy private collectors today. I also take you from the bustling streets and bazaars of 19th and 20th century India to the 17th century Mughal court and its famed ateliers. In his marvelous study, Trading Territories, Jerry Broughton considers how the globe and other cartographic instruments like manuscript and wall maps, atlases and charts, like the ones we have seen earlier today, came to reflect not just an increasingly global world, but also to constitute it in the early modern period. From the early years of the 16th century, terrestrial globes became increasingly crucial to the exercise of state power in Europe, as well as to the surging search for new markets and tradable goods. As importantly as prestige objects, globes and maps became part of a new gift economy of circulation and exchange. In the process, they helped fashion new bourgeois, mostly male, but not totally, modalities of the self. Not surprisingly, as Broughton notes, it's upon the figure of the globe as both a visual image and a material object that many of the social and cultural hopes and anxieties of the period came to be focused. Building on this insight, I turn to the Mughal court, where the globe of the earth, arriving from Europe as a novel object and also as representation, was incorporated into the luminous productions of the Mughal atelier, particularly under the patronage of the great emperors Jahangir and Shah Jahan over the course of the first half of the 17th century. The three principal forms it takes in these exquisite Mughal paintings are as a cross-bearing orb, as an unmarked ball, and most interestingly for my purpose, as a terra aqueous sphere, albeit without the usual cartographic grid. Even while its form comes to be taken on board, confirming as it did inherited Islamic Arabic notions of Earth as an immobile spherical entity resting within a cosmos of nesting spheres, the globe allowed imperial artists of the Mughal court to visually enact their patron's claim to be world Caesar, Jahangir, monarch of the world, Shah Jahan, and world grasper, Alamgir or Aurangzeb. Their very names, with the Persian words Alam and Jahan, signaling their global aspirations, for which this novel object came in particularly useful. So in numerous paintings, the emperor is painted holding the globe or standing on it, his feet resting on land formations, invariably delineated but rarely identified or named, marked on its surface, while his body, elaborately bejeweled and sumptuously clothed and haloed, soars gloriously into the cosmos itself. Frequently he's shown obviously exercising his lordship over others, as in this painting, which has been widely interpreted as Shah Jahan receiving the submission of an important Hindu, possibly Rajput prince. In his charming memoir, Jahangir Nama, usually dated to the 1620s, Jahangir grandiosely observed that the labor of emperors is the domination of the world, Jahangiri. His artists imaginatively and ingeniously seized upon the globe, arriving in their midst as essentially a novel foreign object and representation, to pictorially assert and elaborately work out this claim in a number of works. This too is a remarkable outcome of this European artifact's artful global travels. So consider this exquisite painting, completed around 1618 by Abul Hassan, arguably the most favored imperial artist in Jahangir's atelier. Responding to a dream of his imperial patron, in which Jahangir's Safavid rival, Shah Abbas, appeared to the Mughal emperor, Abul Hassan painted what art historian Jeremiah Losty describes as one of the greatest of political pictures from any culture. In Jahangir's dream, as captured pictorially by Abul Hassan, the two emperors, who actually never met, are shown embracing each other against the background of an immense halo composed of a radiant sun and a beautiful crescent moon supported by two angels. Jahangir is painted lighter and brighter than his dark-complexioned rival, but he is also bigger than the Persian potentate, who appears frail and meek, his arms unable to grasp the majesty of the great man he seeks to embrace. For Mughal art historians, this painting is the most striking instance of a series of dream images that came to be produced in Jahangir's atelier, pictorially translating his oniric visions into material representations. My interest in this work, as you can imagine, lies in the fact that both sovereigns are shown standing on a large terrestrial globe, only half of which is visible, an inscription in Persian identifying the equator. Alone among the many Mughal works that I have analyzed, this globe is shown oriented with north facing up, as in the contemporary European object. The general configuration of territory shown on the globe are clearly derived from European maps, although the level of detail on the map of India exceeds anything known about the subcontinent in the West at that time. Many places are clearly named, including Agra, Delhi and Lahore, and Iran and Portugal. Historian Simon Digby has in fact suggested on the basis of this work alone that clearly Jahangir must have owned a terrestrial globe of European origin. The painting also offers a striking illustration of the Dad-o-Dam motif, which becomes ubiquitous in subsequent years, namely a ferocious beast of prey, Dad, usually a lion, lying down peaceably with its potential victim, the dam, generally a lamb, on the surface of the globe. Since it is Jahangir's dream that is visualized in this painting by his artist, the lion on which he stands sprawls across a good part of his rival's domain, which is labeled as Iran under one paw, as well as extends into what we would today call Central Asia, a part of the world that had once been under the sway of Jahangir's ancestor Timur. In turn, the vast Safavid empire is reduced to some paltry territories that the lamb is made to rest on, to the north and east, or what we recognize today as the Mediterranean. Europe hardly matters in this vision, barely visible, as you can see, on the left margins of the globe and of the painting. It has been argued that English allegorical images which flow into the Mughal court increase whose flow into the Mughal court increased with Thomas Roe's embassy to Jahangir's court, the growing activity of the English East India Company from the 1610s, and the waning of Portuguese and Catholic influence in imperial circles, these paintings such as these exercised a transformative influence over the imperial atelier around this time, even as they helped to translate the emperor's dreams into pictorial reality. In particular, art historians have pointed to the so-called Ditchley portrait of Elizabeth I that many of you may be familiar with, the work of Marcus Garretts the Younger. As Roy Strong reminds us, the portrait is the largest done of the English queen, and even after its edges have been trimmed, its effect on its contemporary viewer must have been quite overwhelming. The portrait presents Elizabeth standing on the globe of the world with her feet resting on a partially visible map of England, wearing an armillary sphere as a hanging ear ornament. Inscriptions in Latin and English associate the monarchical presence with cosmic control of the elements, her very presence banishing storms and ushering in sunshine. It is almost impossible to believe that a large and singular portrait intended for an English stately home, or even a copy, would have arrived in Jahangir's court as a present from the British monarch to his Mughal counterpart. This is not least because such a gift raises the question of why a Jacobean king would have sent along portraits of a predecessor from whom he sought to distance himself. And yet the Ditchley portrait has been regularly invoked until today in the scholarship on Mughal paintings as the inspiration for the new global paintings of the Mughal court. Even while strongly disagreeing with this dominant interpretation, I do want to note that in Abul Hasan's painting, as in numerous others, the terrestrial globe's mapped surface allowed the imperial artist to pictorially insist that it was not so much territory that mattered to the great emperor, as it did in Europe, but the fact that lion and lamb lay together peaceably in his benevolent shade. So it's a different model of kingship that is being asserted here. Equally importantly, I want to argue that the Mughals do not appear to have been interested in the globe qua globe. For instance, it does not appear to have become the subject of scientific study in the Mughal realm, nor did it promote a turn towards modern cartographic production, as arguably happened in Ottoman Turkey, and farther to the east in Ming and Qing China, in Tokugawa Japan, and in Chosun Korea. On the contrary, the globe's utility in the Mughal court appears to have been solely as an artifact with whose help calculated displays were offered of the emperor's body. In fact, in the known images of the Mughal atelier, we see the terrestrial globe only in the company of the emperor or with figures associated with the exercise of imperial authority, such as the Sufi sheikh. It is clearly an object of imperial distinction, and as such, joins the company of other such similar artifacts, such as the royal crown, the turban ornament, and the inscribed gem. In contrast to these latter artifacts, though, the terrestrial globe as representation and as object was clearly an exotic in the Mughal realm. As such, its potential as an alien, even disturbing arrival, was tempered by pictorially incorporating it into the sumptuous productions of the imperial atelier, and by placing it at the service of the emperor's painted body, to enact his visions and dreams. In turn, that painted body was able to distinguish itself as a worldly, indeed global self. Possibly because of its very alterity in the Mughal realm, the globe in such painted productions is generally more than the prop it appears as in contemporary European art. Instead, all manner of complex visual dramas and dreams of self and sovereignty are enacted and staged around its very presence in these imperial paintings. I take up two more such fantastic visual dramas that come to be enacted on behalf of the emperor with the help of this novel artifact, both of them once again the work of Abul Hassan. In both works, the emperor is shown taking aim. In this one, at the severed black head of a most recalcitrant foe, the Abyssinian general and de facto ruler of Ahmednagar, a major kingdom in the central India, Malik Ambar, and at a dark, emaciated figure personifying poverty, Dalidar. In both works, Jahangir is rewarded for apparently succeeding in his aims by angels and cherubs rushing to confer marks of imperial sovereignty on him. Most interesting for the purposes of my argument is a large terrestrial globe on which Jahangir stands in both works. That the artist thought it significant to enact these complex visual dramas with the aid of this newly introduced object, carefully painted with an astonishing attention to detail, as imperial stage prop is telling. Indeed, it's hard to think of these enactments without its presence. So in the painting featuring the decapitated head of Malik Ambar, the globe is supported on an ornate stand and is oriented with east on top. The territorial configurations, and I'm sorry you can't see in the projection here, on the map conform to some of Abul Hassan's other efforts from roughly around the same time. But in contrast to the work that I discussed earlier of Jahangir and Shah Abbas on the globe, place names are not inscribed on this one, although several river courses are clearly delineated, including what we would today readily recognize as the Indus and the Ganges. Europe is much more visible on this globe, as is a large swath of territory that appeared in many early modern European maps, Terra Australis. Several animals of different species peacefully cohabit on the surface of the map, and I'm sorry again you can't see it in this projection, but we have a cow suckling a lion and a dove and a hawk fluttering together across what we would think of today as in Northern Asia. So this is indeed a vision of a harmonious utopia as pictured in the Mughal atelier. In the painting celebrating Jahangir destroying poverty, the globe is not placed on a stand, although we can clearly see land formations and various bodies of water drawn on the globe. And the map itself doesn't conform to any known prototype. The world map is also obscured by a very large Dad-o-Dam pair. Abul Hassan provides a nice twist to this familiar motif by having the lion's tail casually lying across the lamp and the emperor's feet, or foot, actually one foot, resting on the large mane, again very casually. This is not, however, the only manner in which the terrestrial globe in this painting is shifted away from purely European appearances. As striking is the fact that it is made to rest on a large fish, on which is also sprawled a bearded man pointing with one finger at an open manuscript. Some scholars have interpreted this enigmatic figure as Vaivasvata Manu, the primeval man and lawgiver, who, in Sanskritic Hindu mythology, of which Jahangir would have been familiar, at least from his own mother, who was actually Hindu. And this figure of Manu was saved from the great flood by Vishnu in his first incarnation on earth as Matsya, the fish. So the third incarnation, the boar, is the one that we encountered at the beginning of the talk. So this is actually the first incarnation. So under the just king then, even Hindu laws are respected. This is what Jahangir's artist might have intended with this motif, according to art historian Robert Skelton. Similarly, in Abul Hassan's painting of the emperor taking aim at Malik Ambar, The stand of the globe rests on a large fish, and the globe itself rests on the back of a large brown ox. What might be going on here? Treatises on cosmology in the wider Muslim world dating from the 9th century on and circulating, as we know, in the Mughal realm as well, tell us that in the first ages, since the earth was oscillating in all directions, God created an angel who took it on his shoulders and grasped it with his hands. The angel had as his support a rectangular rock of green hyacinth, itself borne upon a giant bull which rests upon a fish swimming in the water. In this painting from a manuscript that circulated in the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th century, we see one attempt at the visualization of this cosmology, as it appears in one of the most widely disseminated pre-modern Islamic illustrated works. This is a text that belongs to a genre called The Wonders of Creation, and its Arabic title translates into English as The Wonders of Creation and the Oddities of Existence. It is attributed to the 13th century astronomer, geographer, and writer Zakaria bin Muhammad al-Qazvini. In several iterations I have seen of this image, Earth is shown resting variously on an angel, a bull, or a fish, all of which in turn have supports of their own. The point is that whatever seems to serve as a foundation for the world must itself have a foundation. The successive foundations seem increasingly precarious until finally one accepts that they all rest upon God. In turn, Earth is configured in various ways in these illustrations. In some cases, it appears as an unmarked sphere. In others, as in this painting, it is a hemisphere striated by the so-called 7 climes, a clean. A late 18th century painting from northern India shows the world as a cylindrical formation held aloft by an angel who in turn has his feet resting on what appears to be a pile of mountains, itself resting on a bull, which has its legs perched on a fish, and so on. In the 1620s, Abul Hassan appears to have appropriated the European terrestrial globe that had begun to circulate as both representation and object in the Mughal court and incorporated it into such inherited understandings of the earth and its place in the cosmos. Such images circulated also, as we know, in the Mughal court. Instead of letting the novel object coming in from distant Europe unseat ancestral understandings of the cosmos, such artists instead make it their own in dramatic visualizations of the emperor's feet resting on a terrestrial globe that itself rests on other beings. Fast forward, really forward to our own times. I have been much taken with such works from India's early modern past, which showed up power and sovereignty, imagined or otherwise, and that have been appropriated in our own times and put to other purposes, including offering a critique of mastery and domination. Over the past 2 decades, contemporary British artists of Indian origin, the Singh Twins, have turned to the Indo-Persian miniature tradition, and they have leavened it with the aesthetic of Indian bazaar art, with which I began this talk, and Bollywood posters. The result is a hybrid form that they self-consciously and ironically describe as past-modern. Although playful and cheeky, it's hard to miss the political edge to these pictorial visions, as in this work where the African-American boxer Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali, has become the world Caesar, not unlike Jahangir of yore. Or consider this work where Reagan and Thatcher have replaced our 17th century potentates from the Eurasian world, even as the proverbial lion and lamb pair of the Mughal atelier is replaced with a sinister vixen and sullen mule that invoke a spirit that is not quite pastoral. In another similar work, George W. Bush is shaking hands with Tony Blair, both men standing on a globe. The US president stands in a pair of cowboy boots on a jackal, while the British prime minister stands on a poodle adorned with a Union Jack bow. Their embrace results in blood dripping down the mapped outline of the Arabian Peninsula. In both paintings, the halo, which Mughal artists so ubiquitously used to signify divine light, Noor, with which their emperor was blessed, has been replaced with the mushroom cloud of a nuclear age. Not least, these paintings offer a critique of globalization by using the artifact that is at the very center of its enterprise, the terrestrial globe. For after all, as Dennis Cosgrove reminded us, it is from images of the spherical earth that ideas of globalization draw their expressive and political force. Here, in the name of uniting the world, the global seems to be a mask for the neo-imperialist takeover by the US, with Britain, the erstwhile colonial power, playing its lackey or pet poodle. So this then brings me to the third and concluding scene of world imagining that I consider this in this talk. And I want to now turn to the work of contemporary artists and what they do with this artifact that they inherit from a modern past, and in fact was the quintessential world image of colonialism, to recall Tim Ingold. I return to the stunning work by Irish artist Tom Molloy, with which I began this talk. In the artist's own self-description, he produces drawings, sculptures, and installations whose economy and delicacy belie the darkness of their subject matter, which is centered upon the human cost of geopolitics. Usually with the US as an enduring focus, Molloy unflinchingly examines the destructive toll of political and economic ideologies, ranging from fascism to capitalism, wars from World War II to the US's war in Iraq, and mass media culture. Literature, maps, money, stamps, and famous figures from history and art history recur throughout his body of work, often heavily redacted. A lot of my work is about evidence, he explains, about examining sources, examining things which you take for granted in the real world, whether they are photographs or texts or stamps or whatever, end quote. Through his simple, pointed reappropriation of these sources, such as the small terrestrial globe, whose surface has been entirely obscured by white paint, apart from the man-made national borders, which have been left uncovered, Molloy transforms them into politically charged objects that seek to yield darker underlying truths. Or consider Beirut-born Palestinian multimedia artist Mona Hatoum, who's been living in London since 1975 when the civil war broke out in her native Lebanon, and whose broad body of work is charged through with a searing argument about cartographic violence. In this brilliant and much discussed installation piece, Hot Spot, a large steel globe of average human height glows red with neon-colored tube light highlighting the continental borders. In installation mode, the globe hums and glows ominously. Hotspot could be a commentary on both global warming and the politically charged climate in which almost the entire world finds itself today. Gallery artists of and from India have been relatively late to embrace the map and the globe form in their work, unlike their more subaltern brethren who produced for the mass market and used cartographic imagery from early on, as I noted early on in the talk. But they too are increasingly doing so in a wide and addressing a wide range of issues of pressing urgency for our times and enlisting the globe form. In the interest of time, I want to focus on three artists with whom I conclude the talk. I begin with the work of Jagannath Panda, whose primary art education was in the eastern Indian state of Orissa, but who then traveled around the world, including a stint at the Royal College of Art in London, where he did a version of this work, in which he took strips from pages of the illustrated Oxford English Dictionary, creating a flux of words and images wrapped around a giant globe. I quote from an analysis by art critic John Xavier. Resting on the floor, this spherical dictionary has an unsettling sense of motion, as it's about to roll around and perturb the existing order of the words on the surface. The dynamic inherent in the spherical form is symptomatic of the condition of globalization, not only in the signification of the globe, but also in its sense of movement. This work is as much about Anglicism as it is about globalization. It shows us how the English language has colonized the globe, but also possibly how the globe has colonized the English language. Note that the globe is totally erased of other languages and scripts, bearing witness to the takeover of our world by a single language of empire and global capital. In Shifting Ecotones by Reena Khaled, another artist whose body of work is shot through with cartographic imagery, the familiar grid of latitudes and longitudes of the terrestrial globe is replaced by barbed wire, as the artist visualizes the vexed problem of the forced migration of peoples across the planet as a consequence of the insidious work of global capital. From the hybrid tree at the apex, the wire traces across the landscape to the roots of the earth, bound into shapes like balls of wool ready to knit together a new community. Reflecting on her oeuvre more generally, the artist herself has noted her, quote, long-standing interest in the relationship between countries, politically split but historically related. The use and ownership of natural resources are often the cause of conflict between our divided countries. I feel the need to think about how our planet is shared and how the survival of one species is inextricably linked to another, end quote. I end with these dramatic works by Ellen Tallur, which also take me back full circle, if you'll pardon my pun, to some of the works I began with where Hindu gods keep easy company with the terrestrial globe. Tallur is a conceptual artist whose work often reaches back into the archive of Indic sculptural traditions as well as Hindu iconography. In the words of a curator of one of his forthcoming shows, Gary Schneider, quote, by pairing the sacred with the secular, handmade with machine-made, or decorative with the functional, Tallur purposefully obscures, transforms, and subverts the traditional reading of these historic references. His works speak to the complexity of the global world we live in, creating a dynamic tension between the past and the present while provoking questions about the future, end quote. So in these works, the mighty Hindu god Shiva, god of destruction and creation, who would have otherwise occupied these fantastic frames, appears to have been evacuated from his abode, his place taken up by a modernist globe of charred wood, in the case of the work titled Obituary Note, and a mass of concrete in the other titled Unicode. Is the artist suggesting that the mighty Shiva has abandoned Earth to its own devices instead of charging in to save it, as Vishnu had done by taking the form of the boar, as we saw earlier on in the talk? If, paraphrasing Martin Heidegger, we can argue that the fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest and display of our planetary world as a spherical object that we refer to in the English language as globe, these works by contemporary artists with which I close this talk remind us how this most imperial of objects can also be appropriated and put to work for a contrary purpose of earth ethics. In her provocative work, Earth and the World, Philosophy After the Apollo Missions, philosopher Kelly Oliver defines Earth ethics as a form of terra filia, through which we love the Earth enough to take responsibility for it, instead of exercising mastery over it. Earth ethics, she argues, serves as a counterpoint to the dangers of technological and economic globalization. Can we imagine an ethics and politics of the earth that is not totalizing and homogenizing, she asks? Can we develop earth ethics and politics that embrace otherness and difference rather than co-opting them to take advantage of a global market? How can we avoid the dangers of globalization while continuing to value cosmopolitanism? As a philosopher, Oliver turns to Kant and Hannah Arendt, Heidegger and Derrida to seek answers for such questions. I suggest that we should also turn to the artists of our time who have artfully appropriated the globe form to think the earth against the globe in the hope of returning ethics to the world. Thank you.
That's a really, really rich talk. Do we have any brave volunteers from the audience who'd like to ask a question?
And thoughts, suggestions, most welcome.
It is now. Hi, I'm David Lambert. That was brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Could you say, when you brought things to the present in terms of the artist, the critical artist you were discussing, I was wondering about what the vernacular popular form equivalents of that, particularly in the light of where we stand with Indian politics at the moment, and the current government's kind of effort to mobilize kind of a notion of a global India, and Indian diasporas and so on. And I was trying to think how that might look, because obviously the triangular-esque geo-body of India stands central, such a distinctive part of the world, just the way it is. But I wonder how that chimes with a kind of how that relates to a kind of a different way of thinking of India within a kind of that curious, both nationalist and diasporic version of that, as articulated by the BJP.
Thank you. Actually, the posters I began with, many of them are absolutely contemporary to our moment. I may have picked examples that, I was trying to show an arc. But in the book, The Goddess in the Nation, I have many examples that are from the current moment, current as of the publication of that book, which was 2010, but you can find it till today, right? So yes, the point you're making, right? You have contemporary gallery artists, ironically, part of global capital, who take the globe form to make this kind of critique, right? Whereas you have this kind of patriotic, commercial artists, subaltern artists, going the nationalist, Hindu nationalist route. So they use the same globe form, but they're doing very different things. One, in the case of many of these contemporary artists, not all, but many of them, they adopt this kind of post-colonial critique, if you will. And the others are actually shoring up a particular kind of Hindu nationalist politics until today. Yeah, so they're actually existing side by side, right? And I hope that wasn't lost in the talk, because I began in the colonial period, but many of those mass-produced posters are produced today. Okay, thank you, David. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Padma Maitland. Thank you for a wonderful talk. My question is, thinking a little bit on the earlier talks we heard this afternoon about how you depict or imagine the unknown. I think what really captured me about this talk is it's more about situating or visualizing what's known. And so that makes me think is then, where is the unknown in these depictions? Like, if it's not on the globe, if it's not in the map, where is it? And I think that could be answered through many, either through the contemporary artist or through other periods you looked at.
Oh, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I have to really punt here because I hadn't thought about it at all in those terms. Though, with the discussion in the Mughal works about one reason they placed those animals there, the argument I make there, if you recall, is that these animals are, the argument is that for the artists, the territorial mastery does not matter. It's the fact that these beings can coexist, so everything is fine and, wonderful in the Mughal realm. But they're also a way of also obscuring what is not known, right? Where you do not have to go in and do the kind of detailed mapping that many of these European maps are beginning to do. I say that carefully because there is, Mughal cartography, where in fact many of these spaces are beginning to be filled in, for sure. But that is also not happening in tandem with the work of these Mughal artists. So that's one hint I have for how the unknown might be featuring here. The other Padma, right? Padma is what is going on in the cosmos. And that is something I'm getting increasingly fascinated with. I don't know how to go back in this. For instance, even, did I do that right? If I wanted to go back to this one, I just go and point at it, huh? Or, actually any of these, right? Actually I need to go down further to maybe one of the Mughal paintings, maybe. I can just go down here, right? Yeah. I'm a Mac user, you can tell from my fumbling about. The other thing to think about is also in lots of these images, right? What is happening in the cosmos, right? And once again, as you can see, and there's lots going on there, which I, have not even begun to pay attention, other than alluding to the angels and the cherubs and, light and so on. But that is also an unknown, it seems to me. An unknown that is not terrestrial, which is what the maps are all about, but the universe, right? And I think that ultimately is also the fascination with these fantastic photographs that are beamed down, right, from these Apollo missions, right? Because it was, yes, we are seeing Earth for the first time with something that is, with cameras that have been produced by humans, but we're also getting a sense of Earth in relationship to the cosmos, which is the real unknown too, right? So those would be two of the ways in which I would begin to think about the unknown, which I think is an interesting rethink of this entire body of work, I think. Yeah, thanks for that wonderful question, yeah. Yes, Sultan, yeah.
Pedestrian question. Are you suggesting there is any sort of genealogical continuity between the Mughal images and the 20th century images? They are formally they are so similar, but obviously one would expect there to be some mediation in the 19th century, and you mentioned the classroom, mass printing in the 19th century, etc., etc. So it would be a much more recent introduction connected with the British Empire rather than with any sort of. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I have to say, I belong to the school of historians who want to resist a linear argument, and I do not think I want to make a linear argument, which is why I was sort of beginning, with sort of the 19th modern, moving back into the early modern, and then bringing us into the contemporary, but holding on to the globe form. So that's what I think I was doing methodologically and conceptually. But you're absolutely right. There is the big 19th century which intervenes. And actually this massive book that I just finished and published called Terrestrial Lessons is all about the 19th century world of globes, including the manner in which they appear in schoolrooms and get used in these rooms to teach modern planetary consciousness, as I call it, borrowing from Mary Louise Pratt's work. I do think artists are looking at previous images and they're educating themselves. So the Singh Twins, for example, the ones, the British artists, are clearly self-consciously reaching into the archive, or maybe the archive is pulling them in. One can play with all of that. And they're really reworking the themes. There's a wonderful group of Pakistani artists, because they too are inheritors of the Mughal tradition. And they do a fantastic job of taking up some of these same Mughal paintings and painting in themes. And I have those paintings discussed in the album that Karan referred to, where they use the globe form to comment on contemporary Pakistani politics. So a lot of these Mughal paintings, you can actually, I use the tools of digital humanities to curate these as an album, because these paintings are just this small, and they were not meant. I did not have a chance to talk about this at all in the talk. These were not meant to circulate widely at all. They were very high-end, exclusive works, which would have been seen only by the emperor and people in his court. Right, so they were these small, and they were placed in albums. So I actually simulated the form using turning the pages technology to create an album, and I curated it with my curatorial notes. And yes, it's the images which are leading you, but you have to go and find the text, but they have a lot of commentary on them. So in that album, which you can Google, you'll find these Pakistani artists who are also engaging with this archive, right? So artists are responding to each other, images are in dialogue with each other. That is sort of the argument I favor, rather than a linear argument about this leading to this, leading to that, right? Though things accumulate and images accumulate as well, right? So I hope that answers your question, huh? Yes.
Hi, so my name is Ademide. This is so wonderful. You have such beautiful images and you read them in such an evocative way. I was struck by one of your earlier images, I think of Nehru at the top.
Contemplating the globe?
And it's so interesting, maybe it's just in this context, but this is the only time you see India doubled, first in the globe and then on the wall behind him. And I wonder what you think the significance of this is, because you say it's the sort of before he's prime minister. And not to read too much into this, but Asia is so prominent on one and India is the only place you see in the other. So I wonder what you think, and he's not looking at either map, so I wonder what the significance of this is to you.
Thank you for that. And actually there are other images in which you see this kind of doubling. There seems to be a hypercartographic presence, but it's very astute that you captured that, you caught that. I think this is also, these kind of mass-produced prints are often difficult to date precisely. So one other reason that as a historian, where, we are taught to do all this kind of careful work, we have to set aside some of that kind of methodological work we do to do a different kind of work with these kind of images. So we think roughly this is from the 1930s because of the publisher, and there's some other surround information. So this is the moment in Indian politics when there was a lot of emphasis on inter-Asia connections, that there was this possible brotherhood. And actually there's now very interesting scholarship coming out on this. So we're not always looking at India in relationship to the West, especially Europe. It's this kind of India-China, India-Japan, those connections that are really coming, and of course at the end of this decade, one of these Indian nationalists goes off and, forms an army and allies himself with the Japanese to take the British on. All these things are happening. So I have wondered whether that is also part of drawing attention to Asia. That's one explanation. In school books, in geography books, in this very tedious history book I have written, I spent a lot of time looking at geography books and doing detailed analysis. The way British colonial education worked, India was often presented as part of Asia, right? And there was a particular way in which the different continents of the world are presented, and then India is nested within Asia. So I've also wondered if that kind of sensibility is coming in. But it is of interest to me that there's this giant terrestrial globe sitting there, and he is, of course, got this contemplative look, and the title is wonderful too. Worrying over India, Bharat ki chinta, that's roughly how I gloss it, but that word chinta has actually got a, really, it's much more than just worrying. It's like profound worrying, it could even be angst kind of, it's got that connotation. Yeah, so that's the way I would read that in a greater, in more depth, yeah.
This is more a comment. I was struck by, it made me think about Satyajit Ray's Apu trilogy.
Yeah.
And the second part, which is Aparajito or Unvanquished.
Okay.
Okay, right.
Go on. As a film studies scholar, I would like
No, I was just struck by how, in this kind of Bildungsroman narrative, in the first part of the Apu trilogy, it's the train that's the sign of modernity. And in the second part, for the teenager Apu, it's the globe that he carries along with him. Right. Right. Which the principal tells him, now you're going to go, a young man is going to go into the world. And doesn't his mother ask him, show me where Calcutta is and then where the village is?
This is a village. Yes,
Right.
It is chapter 5.
I will turn to the chapter.
Yes, I love that story. And, the enormous scholarship on Ray and the enormous scholarship on the trilogy, the globe is
Right, it's not mentioned at all.
And Apu takes it all the way as a globe man into Calcutta. I found all these fantastic drawings, because Ray did all these storyboards.
Right.
He's drawn the globe very carefully, placed it on the windowsill. There's all kinds of things. So
Right.
I use an argument which I draw from the anthropologist Ken George, who asks us to think about objects as companions. So I use it to think about Apu's relationship to that school group, that really humble school group, as a companionable object, and how it helps him become a man of the world.
Right.
And really, I said, there's a fantastic use of the globe to question his ancestral profession too. Remember,
The priestly
his mother wants him to
profession.
become a priest. And instead he says no, he's touching this globe.
Right.
Right? And remember that scene when the mother is packing his goods when he goes off to Calcutta?
With the
only
mustard
thing he
oil.
doesn't want to be
Right.
packed is his globe. I mean, it's an amazing 10 minutes film about the terrestrial globe.
Right.
And yeah.
Thank you.
Love working on that part of the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. This is just making me wonder if there are personifications of the nation of India as like a lady, and whether that was sort of proliferated and promoted. Yeah.
I have written, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
Okay, great.
1890s in the print realm, and a lot of it, it's actually a fusion, I would say, of imagining India as a land, as a female figure, that getting hybridized with incoming images of Britain as Britannia, and the result of that is Mother India. But the reason I got interested in Mother India is not because of Mother India, that we could write about her, there's lots written about her, but the fact that when that imagination is materialized and visualized, it reaches for the map form. So she's often shown, not always, but invariably, I would say, shown with a map of India. Either she's occupying it completely, or she is sort of, what part of her body, as somebody pointed out, the peninsular shape of India accommodates itself very well with this idea, lends itself to this idea. Sometimes she's perched on a globe. Sometimes even the map, everything is dispensed with and her body is arranged. Her sari, her hair, all of that is arranged to reproduce the shape of India. So there's various sort of computations and configurations, right? And I was very interested in tracking these and making an argument about what is the body, the female body doing? How is, and what J.B. Hardy famously called empty social space, how is that being feminized, anthropomorphized? Particularly, I was very interested in showing, especially through the visual realm, how such an Indians have to sing a hymn to prove your credentials as a true Indian. You have to say that Mother India is your goddess and all this kind of stuff. So till today, it has real political resonance in Hindu nationalist politics. Awesome. Thank you.
I'm Giorgio Riello from the University of Warwick. Thank you for Sumathi for such a thought-provoking paper comparing two periods. I have two not very well formulated thoughts of questions. The first one is I was struck by the ways in which the globe is a represented object. So I go back to my specialism of material culture. Is an object that is always represented. It is very three-dimensional. In this sense, very different from Queen Elizabeth sitting on England that is completely flat. So it's quite a different. So I wonder if you want to say something about that, because it's an object present but also represented but quite absent. And the second thing, I got from your paper that there are two ways of interpreting the global here. One is an issue of sovereignty, an issue of power, and the other one is an issue instead of consciousness. And I got it very clearly for your 20th and 21st century analysis, slightly less for the 16th century, in which I got the sovereignty, but not as much the consciousness. So I wonder if you can say a bit about that in the case of India.
Interesting. Thank you, Giorgio. You're right. It's one of, when I began to do this project, because I'm not an artist myself, right? I did spend quite a bit of time thinking about what are the kind of challenges it takes for an artist in any period, but especially when they encounter this object for the first time, right, as a spherical ball, and then they have to actually translate it into this kind of two-dimensional surface, as you put it. And then I didn't go anywhere with that argument, other than, when I spoke to art historians, they would point to, the kinds of techniques one uses, right, to produce through shading and positioning, to show the three-dimensionality of the work. And if I can just turn, to this printed image, which is, of course, based on a painting, right, which then becomes, excuse me, I'm not very good at, like even a globe like this one, right? Am I here? Yeah. There is the manner in which in this work as well, the artist has tried to get the three-dimensional quality to it. And I think, for the Mughal globes, one could make an argument that, like even in this one, right, you do get a sense of, through the shading, right, that this is not a flat surface at all, that it is actually a sphere. Now, the Elizabeth one is actually, and Matthew is here, who is much more of an expert on this, but this is actually, Saxton's atlas, which are just the map of England, right, Matthew? Which had just recently been mapped, and that's actually, and scholars have done so much work on this, but actually in the background, you can see globe. So it's actually very similar to what is going on in India, right? England is the only country, not even England, there are only some of the counties that matter to her that are under her feet, right? And they're actually mapped onto a globe there. You see it in the background as a shadowy figure. So there is the, I don't know whether I'm getting to the point I guess you're trying to ask about how does one, whether the objectness of the object is lost in its flatness. Is that what you're getting at with the first question?
I'm not entirely sure what. But it kind of struck me as a kind of tension between two-dimensional representation of something and the fact that you are referring always back to something that is very three-dimensional. In fact, it is the three-dimensionality that becomes central to reflect.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, the other way I want to, I think lurking behind your question is this very important problem that scholars have grappled with, right? Which is the post where you want to get us to focus on the materiality, which is why I found what is called the post-representation film very useful to think with, right? Where you confront the materiality. Not that these things are not material. Every painting is a material object. The paint itself is a material, right? And it will think about the materiality in representation as well. But I think part of the reason I ended up by writing the Mother India book separately from the Globe book is I allowed, when I wrote my Globe book, the Terrestrial Lessons book, I really took the materiality part of it much more seriously than I did when I was analyzing the images as such, to think about what it means to hold the globe, to touch it. And I was very struck by somebody who showed an image with the hand. I'm forgetting who it was in our earlier, Zoltan did. And I was again, thinking about the role of the hand in not only painting, but also grasping this object, right, and touching it and feeling it and all the affects that follow from that. So I think that may be the important productive aspect also of this question of the 2-dimension and the 3-dimension. The second question, I don't know how to answer that question at all, because I think I wasn't asking it for the Mughals, whether there is an argument of consciousness there. And I don't even know whether the archive will even enable me to answer this. One other reason I got fascinated as a modern historian, as a 19th and 20th century historian, with the early modern period is not just because the globe arrives for the first time in that period, so I needed to know what was going on there and then what happens differently in the 19th century, but it's only through these paintings we even know that the globe arrived. The vast verbal archive of the Mughal Empire, there's hardly any mention, in fact none at all, of the globe, just 1 or 2 passing references, right? So without that, I can only use the paintings themselves to do the work for me and to make me ask the kind of questions. So I do not even know how to use this body of painting for the Mughal works to ask the kind of consciousness questions. For the contemporary artists, they are speaking and they're happily leaving traces, of their interviews, and I get that, right? But there is no such commentary. So I do not even know whether I can even begin to answer that question, which is an interesting problematic to work with. Whether this was, some people have used this painting to think that, these are works that show the anxieties that Jahangir have. And as a historian, I'm not sure how I can even, I don't do psychological history, so I do not go there, right? So people have used this painting to make an argument about Jahangir's anxieties. I don't go there. I just sort of read the image for the kind of work it does and what the work that the globe was doing at its time. Does that make sense? Yes.
This was great, and I'm kind of struck by and hung up and confused by the logic of the relationship between the icons and figures in these Mughal images. I think the one with Elizabeth seems more straightforwardly hierarchical, right? Like she's on top of England, and kind of there's some kind of, it's a representation of hierarchy and kind of. But the Mughal ones, they seem, I guess I'd like to hear you kind of expand on actually the precise logic that's at work in those images, where is it that, standing on top of the animal, is there a kind of like personification or kind of isomorphism between those figures? But that's, or is it like, again, is that or is it hierarchical? Is it, kind of standing on top of, in control of this and control of that? But that then seems to break down when you get to the fish, right? It's a fascinating image, but actually I'm quite confused by the actual logic of.
You mean like these ones, huh?
Exactly. Like, what is the? yeah, exactly. Like what actually is going on as you go down? Like the cosmological one on the left, there's some. I don't know the precise logic of it, but like I can kind of understand how it's one supporting the other. But when you get to the Mughal emperor, I don't actually know the term.
Perched, yeah, the emperor, yeah.
Like what is happening?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is very confusing, and I would like to hear you.
Well, let me begin actually. There was an earlier question about the flat Earth, which came up in the discussion, and in the book that the book that I published called the Terrestrial Lessons book, the big problem that I wrestled with there is the manner in which British colonial educators and then Indians who got educated tried to convince Indians that the Earth was a sphere, that it is not flat. It is not that, all Indians necessarily thought that the Earth was flat, but a dominant religious, a dominant set of ancestral notions suggested that the Earth is like a disk. But Indian astronomical traditions, which were also inherited actually from Greeks, because the Greeks were wondering about too, and they influenced Indian astronomical traditions, from the 6th century onwards, also had an alternate notion of the Earth as a sphere. These two camps battled it out for numbers of centuries, and there's enormous discourse on this. And one of the grounds on which they battled it out is, if the Earth is a sphere, how is it just hanging in the cosmos? And this was not just an Indian debate. There were things like this going on in Europe too, right? I mean, ether and all this arcane stuff, which I was struggling to understand when I was trying to do this project. And the argument was, well, the Earth is resting on something else, and it's further that is resting on something else, and that is resting on something else, right? Similar arguments were going on in the Islamic world, which is what this was pertaining to, right? So in the Islamic logic, everything is resting on something else, and ultimately, it's God holding it up, right?
That makes total sense for the cosmological one.
Right.
But actually, when you translate that to the emperor in this kind of like political, ideological situation.
So you think he's being undermined, huh?
Like the logic is, there's like a mixed logic at work. And I'd be fascinated to hear actually how you work out that logic. Is it a isomorphism between cosmological basis and ideological basis? Or is it like, because the relationship between the emperor and the globe is not the same as the relationship between the cattle and the fish?
Yeah, because the globe is the novelty, right, that comes in.
Exactly. So like, there's seems to be like an epistemic break.
Yeah.
That's quite different than the cosmological diagram, but then like mapped onto it.
No, I think you're right. I had not thought about it as mixed logic. I thought, isn't this so clever that here they have this ancestral notion which they don't want to shed, but then they find this, fantastic new object that comes in and lends itself to this emperor in such interesting ways. And I have read it as them accommodating these together. But your question makes me realize that actually Jahangir, he's sort of perched on this globe, and he could actually easily, if the fish moves, he could actually be, dumped, right? And that is not good for imperial sovereignty. So there is that written in, if that's what you're getting at, possibly. In that other one, where there is the primeval man at the bottom, there I think there's a contradiction there, because it suggests that the emperor's power is maybe not all, it is undermined, right, by the cosmic man who may be propping up. That is actually fascinating to think with, and I had not thought about it at all, about that other being. Unlike these animals, this other being may actually be countering his power, which is a very interesting thought. So thank you for planting that in my head. And I don't think the scholarship on that painting is going to help me either, because everybody who's written on that is stuck by the fact that individual, who they have interpreted. I mean, we are guessing at all this because there is no written material on all this to help us either. So, yeah. But it is mixed logic. You're absolutely right, because they're two different potentially incommensurable systems that are being rendered commensurable, which is what I thought was the ingenious aspect
For
of
what
these
it's
works.
worth, that's exactly true of this beautiful map as well. It's a hybrid of two completely incompatible epistemological and cosmological
Right.
systems. And I think that is one of the hallmarks of the early modern
Yeah.
cultural encounter. We
Right.
get these mashups that don't
Right.
really make sense. But
Yeah. To us, they don't,
Yeah.
right? And
Right.
it's the interesting ways in which they try to accommodate these, right?
Exactly.
Instead of casting.
Exactly.
And things may have gotten cast out too. Lots of, foreign exotic things are coming in. They get cast out. They never leave a trace in the archive, right? So that's also likely, I think.
I think we're getting a sense of how much fun it would be to take a seminar with Sumathi Ramaswamy. We have time for maybe one more question, and then I think we should let this great staff go home. Yeah.
But I would like to hear from a young student, who introduced himself to me earlier.
Hi, I'm Arman Kassam, and I was really fascinated with what you had to say about barefoot cartography, and it actually kind of reminded me of what Benedict Anderson was talking about with newspapers, and how you can have a really ritualized practice that over time kind of sediments the nation. And I was kind of interested in what you had to say about the consumption of these very commoner maps, not only as individual consumption, but also as a very socialized consumption, the knowledge that someone else is also consuming it. And I just wanted to
Trust the undergraduate to ask the impossible question, no? That's why we teach, because your students challenge us. Actually, Arman, right? Did I remember your name correctly? Yeah. So, one of the most challenging parts of doing this history is we can say so little about consumption of these images. Every now and then we come across another image in which you see some of these images depicted in the background. So I was so excited when I found a photograph from Benares from the 1960s, when a well-known European photographer was wandering about Benares and photographing the city, and he went off and he photographed a goldsmith's shop. And the focus of the photograph was on the goldsmith. But I was excited because in the goldsmith shop, excuse me while I pull this up, this mass-produced poster was hanging in the background. And this is a famous story of a major Indian patriot called Bhagat Singh, who was hung by the British colonial state. He's rarely shown being hanged. He's always shown being decapitated, because it fits into other model of bloody sacrifice and all of that. So there's a lot I have done with this poster, and this was actually hanging on the back of this humble goldsmith shop which Richard Lanoy, the photographer, was photographing. So there, I was so excited. My one consumption image I can use. And the reason I remember all these petty details about this from 20 years ago is because it was my one image to make the point. So, there's so little, unlike in contemporary European history where so many people have the kind of archives, and I have such envy of these kind of archives where you can know how these objects are coming into homes, how they're being used. We can say very little about the way the everyday Indian was using these. We see them everywhere, but what they say about them, much more difficult. The fantastic anthropologist Christopher Pinney, who's done a fantastic work. I mean, he's the inspiring figure for so many of us who do this. As an anthropologist, he goes around and interviews people, right? And he sees these images in people's homes. And so he can say what is happening in his time. But for historians, if you're looking at how were these images consumed in the 1920s, 1930s, much more difficult to establish impact through consumption by the everyday citizen. What we can say is the manner in which artists are consuming these images vis-a-vis each other. That's why there's such a interesting continuity, or continuity is not the word I think I'm looking for. You can see the traces when they are responding to each other, right? So the motifs travel across these images. So we can get to consumption within the world of artists in that manner. But it is the really, the reception, the and the reuse and the way people thought about these images, very tough to establish, with archival confidence. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, on that note, let's thank our keynote speaker once again for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And doors open at